It's true, like it's said. Um, I've spent much of my adult life fighting the two-state solution. Since I made Aliyah almost 20 years ago, I've been part of a sector of Israeli society that's, I would say, deeply living the aspirations of the Jewish people, and is, of course, therefore very much committed to the land of Israel, especially the lands that we took in 1967. And the lands we've been struggling to come back to for 2,000 years. I mean, these are the places that have been central to our narrative: Shiloh and Hebron and Beit El, etc. And therefore, so long as the two-state paradigm was presented to us as the only paradigm for achieving peace with the Palestinians, we, by default, had no choice but to be anti-peace. I don't think that my sector, I really don't think that my sector has more issues with Palestinians, whether it be their identity, recognizing their story, understanding the extent to which we're responsible for their suffering, any more than any other sector in Israeli society. I don't think that's limited to Jews who live in the West Bank. I think that's really across, the state of Israel. There's a willful blindness to what Palestinians are experiencing, their identity, their narrative. The truth is, I think it's also true in reverse. I think we're right now stuck in a situation where we're both very much afraid to engage the stories of the other. But now that we're able to move past the notion of partitioning this country in half, I think it's clear that the contradictions between my sector of Israeli society and the Palestinians is much less antagonistic than the contradictions between what we can call mainstream Israeli society and the Palestinians. I actually think that in a one-state reality, Jews like me might have an easier time getting along with Palestinians than Jews in, the Merkaz, for example. But that being said, I think it's also important to point out that, right now, no solution can work. Not a two-state solution, not a one-state solution, certainly not the status quo, and that's because the relationship dynamics are a problem. One of my friends and colleagues in Bethlehem, Sami Awad, likes to compare this to a picture and a frame. The painting is our relationship, and the frame are the solutions everybody tries to put onto our relationship. And I really think that at this point, we need to be focusing a lot more on fixing the picture, on fixing the painting. And then, as Sami says, many more frames will become available. Instead of trying to start with the frame, trying to start with the solution, saying this is what has to be. But that being said, I think that it's important to also talk about what we want. And this is actually, very much an internal Jewish conversation. We don't have any Palestinians joining us today, on the call. I'm sure that Peter has spoken to many Palestinians. I've spoken to many Palestinians, heard a lot of different perspectives. But I think that it's important, even sometimes before we engage them and also before they engage us, for us to both be very clear about what we want. So the best I think we can do, in addition to fixing those relationship dynamics right now, is to create the conditions for the solutions we want to see. And for me, that's very much a single state between the river and the sea that allows both Jews and Palestinians to realize our deepest aspirations, to be able to feel like winners in the respective stories we're living in our respective narratives. And when I talk about narratives, what I really mean is a collection of facts that are really selectively chosen and contextualized within an ideological worldview. I think, Jews and Palestinians have experienced two completely different stories over the last 100 years. We're living in two completely different conflicts. We understand the conflicts very different. I think we're both telling the truth when it comes to our own identities, but I think we're both not understanding, as I said before, the identity of the other. So we have a tendency on both sides to really superimpose identities, ideologies, and motivations on the other that often have very little to do with how the other experiences himself. And that's kind of led us to a situation where we're really fighting our fantasy antagonists of the other instead of who the other actually is. So it's not even productive as a method of struggle if the goal is to win at the other's expense. So really, we have every incentive, I think, both Israelis and Palestinians, to really engage the identities, the stories, the grievances and the aspirations of the other in a very, very real way as the other is experiencing those things, and unpack them. Because if we're interested, or at least I'm interested, in creating a solution here that could be experienced as victory for both peoples in our respective movies, then that really requires us to unpack the grievances and aspirations of both sides. and maybe in this debate we'll at least be able to talk about the Jewish side, talk about the aspirations of the Jewish side and what the people of Israel need in order to feel like winners in the story we're living in, and how to get to that, how to get from where we are right now to a place where Israelis are much more willing to open ourselves up to the Palestinian story, to their narrative, to their grievances, and to recognize what we've contributed to this conflict instead of just trying to be the victim.